For this week's tutorial, I'm painting this lovely Brambling. I found this really nice reference photograph on Pixabay, and I chose Brambling because they're a really nice winter bird we get in the UK sometimes. I don't see them every year, but it's always really nice when I do, so that's the subject of today's painting. Unfortunately, I forgot to press record when I did the background to this, so it has missed me putting that first initial wash on of French Ultramarine and Alizarin Crimson. You will notice in the next clip that the background's already painted while I talk about the colours and the equipment used. I will show you roughly what I did, but I tried to keep it really simple so you didn't miss too much, and the rest of it is recorded. So as usual, I'll list the equipment used in the description box below. I tried to keep the colours simple here, and I used three main primaries, so French Ultramarine, New Gamboge and Cadmium Red, and I tried to do the majority of the painting just using those three. I had some Hansa Yellow Light to begin with because I thought I might need it for the beak, but actually you could do that without. And as I said, I used Alizarin Crimson in the background, but I didn't need a separate red for that. I could have used the Cadmium Red. I prefer to put my colours around the edge of the palette and then mix everything in the centre so they can swirl together. It does mean that it is more difficult to say exactly what colour I'm using, but it's a really nice way of ending up with interesting colour mixes. The brushes that I used for this were my number 12 round brush. This was really useful for putting in the background. It was larger, so it enabled me to get a really nice even wash. I use my number 6 rigger brush for the majority of the bird to get the main background in on the bird and then to add a couple of details. I also use my number 3 rigger brush for some of the fine details and to put in the highlights in the eye. I use my white gouache for those highlights. If you don't have that, you could use acrylic or you could use masking fluid. This is a really simple idea of what I did for the background. So I mixed together my crimson and my French ultramarine, and I just added it in a really simple wash, trying to keep a nice consistency of paint and water, just dragging it down the page in a continuous motion, trying to collect the water on the bottom and make sure everything was evened out. This took a couple of attempts. I was not very good at this the first time around. It ended up looking quite streaky, but I think I got there in the end for this one. I also lifted out a couple of areas as well, you can see in the background, just to add a tiny bit of detail and indicate that there might be twigs in the background. You don't have to do that, you could just keep it as it was, but I felt like it just added something extra. I started out with French Ultramarine and a little bit of New Gamboge. I added a tiny bit of red just to tone down the green, and that created this lovely slate grey colour to start with the sunflowers. We'll probably refer to French Ultramarine, New Gamboge and Cadmium Red just as red, yellow and blue for the majority of this tutorial now, just to save a little bit of time. I mixed some more red and yellow in with a slate grey mixture to create the lovely brown tone for the centre of the sunflower. I wanted that to be more on the reddy orange side, and then I'm going to make a darker mix to put around the edges for some shadow details. I'm trying to make sure that the consistency of the paint is similar so everything blends together nicely and we don't end up with back runs and watermarks that we don't want. Anytime I wanted to make more of a shadow tone, I would just add more of the blue and the red to get a nice deep purple, and then a little bit of yellow just to tone it down so it was more of a grey brown rather than just a purple tone. And I made sure that there wasn't as much water in that bit so that it was a darker mix and it stood out, and I added that on top of the colours that I already put, allowing everything to blend together and creating some spiky details for the centre of the sunflower just for a little bit of texture. I softened a few edges as I went with a slightly damp brush, not adding too much water there again to avoid those back runs, and I also lifted out some colours to preserve some highlights. As the background began to dry, but it was still a little bit damp, I added another round of that darker colour, so the red and blue with a tiny little bit of yellow, just to put on top of that. I didn't use as much water this time around, and I used my rigger brush for this. It doesn't carry as much water as around 6 does, so it's sometimes easier to put darker details on without diluting it too much with the water from the brush. Now I'm just defining a few shadows just to give a little bit more shape to the sunflower head, and then it'll be time to move on to the bird. I don't want to overdo this bit too much because the focus should definitely be on the brambling. So to begin with, I used a really similar colour to that slate grey I had before, so primarily blue with a tiny little bit of new Gamboge and a little bit of red, just until I felt happy with the mix, and then I placed that on the bird's face. This is going to be the base which all the other colours are going to sit on top of. I added in a little bit more new Gamboge around the top of the head because it seemed a little lighter in the picture, and just tried to blend everything together so that it ran smoothly and there weren't too many hard edges. Next I moved on to the brightest area of the bird, and I began with new Gamboge mixed with a tiny bit of red and that slate grey colour from the face. I added some more new Gamboge for the brightest area along the bottom edge there, and then I used water just to drag all that colour down so that it gradually faded as it went. I used the slate grey colour for the front of the bird because there's a shadow that runs all the way underneath, and by adding it at this point it just meant that it could blend in with that yellow colour on the top. Because I'm not working wet in wet here, I had to work fairly quickly before the paint dried. I wanted to try and get the colours to blend in certain areas rather than forming lots of hard edges. This didn't always work, but that was the intention, and I think if I were to do it again, I might just have a slightly damper consistency of paint, if that's the right word, just so it would give me a little bit more time to blend everything together. Across the back, I am using more French Ultramarine and a little bit of the yellow colour to make more of a green grey, and that's going to form the back of the bird. I will add some detail later. This is really just about blocking in the colours. I'm adding a little more of that orange colour in a strip here, and I'm not too worried about how neat this is. This area is going to be bordered by some black feathers on either side, so they're going to form the main shape. This really is just about placing the colour, and then I'll go over the detail later. I kept the legs and the feet really simple, just using leftover colours from the palette. So I used that slate grey colour for some shadow on the top of the leg, and then for the leg itself I used a mix of what was on there, more of that orange colour mixed in with some of the blue to create the base of the foot. I used that for both of these, and then I went over with a darker colour later just to add in a little bit more detail and more form. I did a really simple wash of yellow over the beak here, so new Gamboge and a bit of Hansa Yellow, but as I said earlier, the Hansa Yellow really wasn't necessary for this. The Gamboge would have done just fine. And here I'm just testing to see if it's dry so I can add in some shadow details. The shadow here is a mix again of blue and yellow and red, just of different percentages, proportions, amounts to create the right kind of shadow that I'm going for. And I'm softening that with clean water as I go, just so it doesn't leave a harsh line all the way across. As we move up, the shadow turns from a purpley blue colour to more of a brown colour, so I add a little bit more yellow and red in that just to get the change in tone. For the shadows on the feet, I used my rigger brush and a thicker mixture of paint. So this one was more on the brown side, so that just means having more red and yellow in with that blue mix. And I dragged some of that out with the rigger just to define the feet and create a little bit of form and shape there. Now that the body of the bird is dry, I can go over again and just darken up some areas. I'm using a similar colour as before, so that new Gamboge mixed with some red and a bit of blue to tone down the orange, and that's going to form some shadow details just underneath the wing there. And then back to the rigger to redefine the shadow on the underneath. This was more on the purple side, so the majority of the colour there is blue and red with just a tiny little bit of yellow to tone that down, and then making it more brown as it moves up again, so adding a little bit more red and yellow to the mix. All of this is softened with clean water as I go, so it's not too harsh of a line. I'm using the same greeny brown shadow mix for the back of the bird here, just to add a little bit of texture. I am going to go over this with a darker colour, but this is just going to add some interest underneath that. I use my shadow tone for some details around the face and some of the darker markings around the brambling. This one is a mix of mainly blue and red for that purple tone with a little bit of yellow just to tone it down a bit. I tried not to make it as dark as I wanted to go because this is going to be the second layer, and I am going to go over it with a much darker mix on top of that. And that way we're just building it up a little bit at a time and hopefully making it a bit more realistic. I'm softening the edges with some clean water as I go, trying not to add too much water, but just getting rid of any harshness and any hard edges there. I'm adding a bit more of an orange tone to the beak just for an extra layer, and that's primarily the new Gamboge and the red mixed together. That same orange tone can be used to define a few of the feathers now, because we're beginning to add a bit more detail as we build this up. And then we're back to that purpley blue shadow mix, and I'm using my rigger to apply that to create some of the details around the tail and the wing feathers. I'm continuing to move around with that shadow tone, just defining a few feather shapes. I am going to go over this again later, so it doesn't matter if it's not perfect, but things are starting to come together at this point. The area between the orange feathers and the black feathers should have a nice gradual shift in colour, so I'm using some water now just to blend that out a little bit so it doesn't have too harsh of an edge there. Now we've got some of that blue shadow tone just on the tip of the beak there, so things are starting to build up now, and we're adding a bit more detail at every step. That same blue is going to be used in the centre of the eye, and then I'm going to use a darker tone on top of that once that's dried. So now it's time to go over all those dark areas again, but this time with a much thicker consistency of paint. So this one is, again, just using those three main primaries, so mainly the blue and the red to make that purple, and then using some yellow to make it more of a black colour rather than the purple tone. And I'm just dotting that with my rigger brush over all the areas we went over before, but still allowing you to see some of those lighter shadow tones underneath for a bit of extra dimension. Here is a great opportunity to define those feathers, so I'm using that dark paint now just to draw around the edges of those areas with my rigger brush and make it look a little bit more realistic and bring it together a bit. I've added a bit more blue-grey to the end of the beak, and now I'm going over with some new Gamboge mixed in with that slate grey colour just to add a bit of an extra wash over the top of some areas in the head to help create some shadow tones and a little bit more interest. Some areas just appeared a bit too light, so this is allowing me to address that. And now I'm using clean water to soften some hard edges and just help blend things together, and we're pretty much finishing touches for this now. So I'm just redefining some of the shadow details that have been lost through blending the edges. And I'm going to add a couple more shadows into the sunflower head as well, just to go around the feet for shadow and in the darkest corners of the edge of that sunflower head. And just before we finish, I'm going to add a few highlights with gouache and putting a highlight in the eye and then going around a couple of the feathers on the edge of the bird there, just where it was really nice and bright, to redefine those highlights. And there we have it, one finished painting of watercolour Brambling. I think this is one of the first times I've ever attempted to paint this bird, so I'm really glad I gave it a go and I'm pleased with how it looks. I think actually one of my favourite parts about this painting is the sunflower head as opposed to the bird. It was done in a really simple way. We used a lot of wet and wet techniques, and I really like how simple it was and how it came together. I think I'll definitely try and employ some of those techniques into future paintings. But I'm happy with the overall result. I really hope you enjoyed watching this. I upload every Wednesday, so I will be back again next week. Thank you so much for watching.